We built our own private cloud. People thought we were crazy. But I think what's interesting is that more and more people are moving out of the public cloud. If you look at the stock market performance of private cloud infra providers like Equinix or Iron Mountain or Digital Realty, you can see that they're growing fast.
Yeah.
And I think it has to do with control and cost, right? I mean, the public guys.
Because it's much more of a fixed cost when you have a private cloud. And so for some people, that fixed cost is a problem because they have a lot of variable nature and stuff like that. Or they might be really big in December and really bad and really low in May. And so it doesn't make sense to have a fixed cost that's out there. But obviously a fixed cost, if you're utilizing it at 80-90%, is going to be much cheaper.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's probably the sweet spot actually for most companies once they reach a certain level of scale is have fixed cost infrastructure that you own that does the vast majority of your work.
And then have the variable for the rest. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because remember, the hyperscalers, they're making 30 to 40% margins, right?
Yeah.
So
the margins are so, it's amazing me how big their margins are. Like, every time they publish it, I'm like, wow, why am I on this thing? Like I would like their margins to be like 10% or something.
Yeah, it's exactly right. So, once you get to a certain scale, then your fixed cost starts to amortize, right? You need a network operating center, you need a team of, infra engineers and whatnot. But you don't need to keep adding to that linearly as you scale up, right? And so you can get huge amount of leverage. I mean, the other thing is these public hyperscalers, I mean, they are working on like a 3 to 4 year CapEx kind of cycle, right? But we found that actually you can let hardware run 5, 6, 7, 8 years.
Yeah.
Right. If you just look at
it.
And
if it dies, it dies. Like,
if it dies, it dies.
Yeah,
exactly. So you build in an extra, 2% of capacity because some stuff's going to be dying all the time. And it works great.
Yeah. Interesting. What is, and do you, are people like calling you up, like other CEOs and other types of like calling them like, hey, I want to do this, or because I imagine like if you did it from the beginning, like you did, and you kind of you had no choice back then because there was no cloud. It's one thing, but if you like moving to that, it could be a huge like monumental shift.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is it's a mindset shift. People, and part of that is I think the hyperscalers are the ones that put out case studies all the time. There isn't case studies the other way, right? Which is like, hey, I went to private cloud and like, look at the benefits, right? Like I'm not putting out that case study. So yeah, we do get that question a lot, and we're happy to talk to folks. I think the other mindset shift that you have to have is you need to continuously be looking at how do you optimize your infrastructure. So we have engineering teams that are looking to see, okay, which database queries are consuming the most amount of processing time, right? What applications or processes are consuming the most amount of memory? And we just look at that. You just stack rank and say, okay, what are the 10 biggest memory hogs? And then you figure out, well, how can I rewrite that application or that component and reduce it? I think when you're in public cloud, you have less of a need to do that because you can somebody will say, hey, we need more compute, and you'll say yes, and like that, you're on that treadmill.
When I remember when we were running around Metal, like the types of people we hired were very different. Like the DevOps people we hired, they were like very super crazily organized. And I remember the guy who was like running our team. He almost had like a military. He could have been like the general of like our army or something. He was like amazing at just like. He was because everything had to be like, okay, tightly. I remember moving from one data center to another, and everything had to be like very, very tightly controlled and tightly organized, and and everything it was very different than like the traditional quote unquote DevOps person who we have at our company now, who's like on AWS.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the reality is when you have your own infrastructure, there's a limiter, which is to deploy new hardware. It can take 3 to 6 months.
Yeah.
Right. And so that creates, I think, a great
You have to plan and you have to think.
Which is then if an engineer is like, hey, I want to do X, but I'm out of resources, you say, okay, well, I can buy you more. It'll be ready in 6 months. Or you can figure out how to make something else more efficient. And then you can use that freed up capacity. And so then you get really good at like, oh, hey, that guy's application, it's not very efficient. Let me help him fix it.
Totally.
And now I can take over that freed up capacity. And I think that's a good mindset to have as a company around efficiency.
Do you have a sense of like, if you just think of like the average company out there, like, Are they at like 90% efficiency? Are they at 10% efficiency? Like, I feel like there seems like there's always a lot to be squeezed out of all these things.
Yeah, look, I mean, we have over a decade now, every year we get 10 to 20% more efficient on our infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right. And we have a relentless focus on this because it's like, it's our bottom
Every
line,
year
it's our
you're 10 to
cash.
20%.
Every year. So,
Okay,
if you
wow.
look at our investor materials, there's a chart that basically shows the cost of processing ad impressions for us. And there's just this big downward line, right?
Yeah.
As we brought it down, that compounding is obviously very powerful. So I would wager that, there's 50% gains to be had inside of many companies from an efficiency perspective.
Yeah, I had 3 different companies in the last year where they were trying to cut costs, and one of the things they're just trying to like even in their trying to like reduce, let's say, their AWS bill.
Yeah.
Maybe their AWS bill was X $100,000 a month, and they want to. And in all the cases, they were able to reduce it by like half.
Yes. Exactly.
So they really try to focus on it. And then one of the scenarios, like they had a problem because they had signed up for, let's say,
yes,
a $4 million cost
exactly.
for AWS. And then they're like, okay, what do we partner with another company and, put the cost together? It's like, et cetera.
I think a lot of companies never thought about this until interest rates spiked after COVID, right?
Yep.
Because we were in, especially with Silicon Valley
Free
type
money.
of company.
Yeah,
we're in this free money era, and it was like growth at all costs. And so it was not seen as cool to put engineering resources on efficiency optimization. And that obviously has changed quite a bit. And so I think that's good. And we've seen the growth rates in the hyperscalers come down. But now, of course, they're going back up due to AI and other use cases.